Today, this paper is written with Sean Nichols. We conducted some experiments that I'll be reporting on. So some philosophy, some experiments, and then some philosophy is the way the paper goes. So let's look at the first part. And that's a dispute about the idea of natural liberty. Is all liberty justified liberty, or is there such a thing as liberty before justification, or liberty before morality even gets going? So here's some of the things that people have meant by natural liberty. Joel Feinberg, who was an Arizona philosopher, said liberty should be the norm. Coercion always stands in need of some special justification. So coercion needs to be justified, not liberty. Liberty is just the baseline. Rawls and Justice is Fairness. There's a general presumption against imposing legal and other restrictions on conduct without sufficient reason. Mill in The Subjection of Women. In practical matters, the burden of proof is supposed to be with those who are against liberty. Who has to prove something? Those who want to limit liberty. And of course, Locke in the Second Treatise is all men are naturally in a state of perfect freedom to order their actions as they think fit without asking the leave or depending upon the will of any other man. So that's sort of some of the canonical formulations. I want to go through one particular story which displays the idea of natural liberty, and then I'm going to come back to that story. That it seems like a silly story, but it's the silliness which is actually the important part of it. So here's the story. It's from my great late friend Stanley Benn. So it's a long story, so read along. It says, imagine Alan sitting on a public beach, a pebble in each hand, splitting one pebble by striking it against another. Betty, a casual observer, asks him what he's doing. She can see, of course, that he's splitting pebbles. What she's asking him to do is to explain it, to describe it as an activity with an intelligible point, something he could have a reason for doing. There's nothing untoward about her asking the question, what are you doing, Alan? But Alan is not bound to answer it unless he likes. Suppose, however, that Betty had asked Alan to justify what he was doing, to give an excuse for doing it. Unlike explanations, justifications and excuses presume at least prima facie fault, a charge to be rebutted. But what can be wrong with splitting pebbles on a public beach? Besides, so far as we can tell, Alan is not obliged to account for his actions. I'll come back to that. Second part of the story, suppose Betty were to prevent Alan from splitting pebbles by handcuffing him or removing all the pebbles from within reach. Alan can now quite properly demand a justification from Betty and a tout coup reply from her that he and his part hadn't offered her a justification for splitting pebbles wouldn't meet the case. She can't say, Alan, you didn't offer me a justification for splitting, so I don't have to offer you a justification for stopping. For Alan's splitting had done nothing to interfere with Betty's actions. The burden of justification, and the burden of proof, according to Mill, falls on the interferer, not on the person interfered with. So while Alan might properly resent Betty's interference, Betty has no grounds of a complaint against him. Okay, that's the whole story. We're going back to it. Now these are the various claims made in this story. And I'm just going to talk about one of them. But the whole story, the full-fledged version of natural liberty, first of all says, a person doesn't need a permission granted by any moral rule to do something without fault. That it's not necessarily the case that if I do something without fault, there's some moral rule that gives me a permission. So that's what he's denying. Someone might say, if you're going to do it, there has to be a moral rule that permits it. He's denying that. Alan doesn't necessarily have to have a permission. So he's not always morally required to cite a permission in the face of a moral challenge by Betty. He doesn't need a permission, so the mere fact that Betty says justify it, he doesn't have to say anything. So in this sense, Alan is under no standing obligation to justify his fying. That's the first part. That's the Alan part of the story. Second part is the Betty part of the story. Interference with or restricting Alan's action requires justification on the part of Betty, and unless Betty, the interferer, can cite a moral permission to interfere, she's morally blameworthy for her interference. Lots of things, many, many claims going on there, and they've all been disputed in the literature. I want to look at what looks like the least controversial, and that is just that first clause. Alan doesn't need a permission, necessarily, granted by any moral rule in order to fy without moral fault. It's not necessarily the case that if Alan is going to act, there must be a moral rule that gives him permission to act. That's what we're examining. This has been a controversial principle, so I don't want you to think that somehow, because we only have this very minimal core, it's not controversial. Many people have rejected this principle. Kantians reject it. As Rainer Force says, a presumption in favor of liberty has to be one of equally justifiable liberty. For a Kantian, you can't have any claim to liberty unless it's justifiable. All acts must be justifiable. Since liberty is an act, it too must be justifiable. So the idea that somehow there's liberty before justification, I mean, that's what natural liberty seems to apply. Before you even begin justification, there's already liberty. And people are suspicious that somehow this is insinuating liberty right into the very heart of moral reasoning. It's not part of the content of moral reasoning. It's part of the very idea of moral reasoning that first there's liberty, then you can justify equality. Then you can justify justice. But first there's liberty. So many philosophers have said, why should there be this asymmetric relation between liberty and other values? If liberty is justified, fine. There should be equally justified liberty. But there can't be liberty without justification. Welfarists and utilitarians also reject this principle. They argue that all actions has to promote welfare. So when Alan acts, he has to promote welfare. And it's perfectly justifiable for Betty to ask, are you promoting welfare? So Kantians rejected, welfarists and utilitarians rejected, some egalitarian communitarians rejected. Gerald Cohn says at one point, you owe it to all members of the community to justify your actions, period. Right? Again, all actions need to be justified. So all these schools, Kantians, welfarists, egalitarians like G.A. Cohn, think that it's important that all moral concepts somehow be on a par. Equality is on a par with liberty. Justice is on a par with liberty. So they accept one version or other of what I call all morally acceptable liberty is justified liberty. Alf only has a liberty to phi if there's a justification for his phi. But that's different than natural liberty, which says he doesn't need a justification for his phi because liberty is the natural default. Okay? So that's the dispute in the very general terms between those who think there is somehow at the heart of moral reasoning an idea of natural liberty and those who think this begs the question, why should liberty have this role? I want to look now at what we expect morality to do. We've been talking very general terms about justification and morality, and that can mean a whole lot of things. So for this paper, I want to narrow that down. Now remember, our original question was Alf and Betty having an argument about his pebble splitting. So it was an interpersonal interaction. Alan was trying to just go ahead and perform his activity, but Betty wanted to interfere. She wanted to stop him, so we had an interpersonal action. So I'm concerned here with what we might call social morality, the morality of interpersonal action. When one person makes a claim, another person makes a counterclaim, and they need somehow, I think, to coordinate their claims. So let me explain what I mean by social morality then. Social morality has three parts, the sort of morality I'm concerned about. It's a system of moral rules in a group or a network, if you don't want to use the word group, that guides behavior, people follow it, but it also forms a basis for shared normative expectations about what a person may or may not do. If Alan and Betty share a social morality, there's shared expectations about whether or not he can break pebbles on the beach or whether Betty can interfere with him. There's also shared normative expectations about what a person can demand that others refrain from or must do. If there's a social morality and the shared expectations, when Betty says you have to stop that, Alan will look at the social morality and say, oh yes, according to the morality, that's something I must not do. So it's not something that we all have on our heads alone, it's something that we're trying to coordinate on. And third, there's shared empirical expectations as to whether people will conform to these rules. Part of having a morality is some expectation that you actually can count on people to behave that way, as opposed to just, as it were, a morality on paper. So I'm talking about that sort of morality. Now this sort of morality has two desiderata, two desirable things that you really have to have a whole lot of for this sort of morality. First of all, the rules of the morality has to be teachable, and so they have to be learnable, right? One of the things we do with morality is we teach it to our children. Kurt Beyer was one of my teachers, And Bayer emphasized that morality is meant to be taught to people. It's not just something we talk about in philosophy seminars about what does morality say. Morality is a real social thing. We teach it to our children when they come home and the teacher writes a note saying your child doesn't understand what fairness is. We don't say, well, I guess that's sort of like not knowing your multiplication tables. No, we say you have to know what fairness is. You have to understand this. We'll teach this rule to you. It's really important. And in fact, parents neglect their duties if they don't teach these rules to their children. So one of the things about morality is not just an interesting theoretical enterprise. It's social in the sense that we teach to our children. And even I taught morality to my daughter. The second desiderata is we want it to be decisive. Remember, we're trying to coordinate action. So the first thing we want to do when we coordinate actions is actually teach our children how to coordinate action, how to live with others. That's one of the things that morality allows us to do. But it also should be decisive in the sense that when you consult morality, you know what to do if you know what morality says. I mean, you may sort of, I'm not sure what morality says because I don't know the rule. But if you know the area of morality, you should know what to say. You should know whether to do it or not do it. For example, imagine a morality is overcomplete. An overcomplete morality, this is something that Amartya Sen talks about, is a morality that says you must do something and you must not do something. Right? So the morality says, here's the rule. You must split pebbles on the beach and you must not split pebbles on the beach. Now, such a rule is overcomplete in the sense it's contradictory. It tells the person to do two things that are inconsistent. They can't do them all, so they can't follow the morality. If a morality is a tool for living together, we can't use it as a tool. So it might look at first that non-decisiveness as undercompleteness is maybe less of a problem, people might think. Of course, overcompleteness is weird. How can you both have a moral duty to do it and not do it? But what if the morality just says, nothing holds in this? It's not that you can't do it. It's not that you can't do it. And it's not that you may do it. None of those things are true. If none of those things are true, it's not contradictory. It just says resolutely, it's not the case you may, it's not the case you must. We just can't say anything about that. Again, that morality wouldn't allow us to coordinate. We couldn't say what morality is because morality just says, on this matter, morality says nothing. Right? Therefore, if that matter is important for us to live together, morality can't do it. Now, if we need teachability, and if we need decisiveness, we need what John McCall calls closure rules. Imagine that we didn't need teachability. We didn't need the rules to be simple enough to teach. Therefore, we could have a complete set, logically, of all possible actions. The rules would have everything that might be done in them, and so you wouldn't need what I'm going to call closure rule, which is a rule which says if the rules don't say something, here's what to do. If you were logically able to teach the full set of rules, you would never need a closure rule. You would never need a rule that says, and if none of the rules tell you what to do, this is what to do. If we didn't care about decisiveness, we wouldn't need a closure rule. Because if the rules didn't tell us what to do, we'd say, well, sometimes the rules tell you what to do, sometimes they don't. Right? But if you combine teachability, which means that there has to be a set of rules which is compact enough to teach to our children, and decisiveness, the rules are always supposed to tell us what to do, those two things together means that we need something like a closure principle. And the closure principle says this: if the rules don't speak, then you may do this, or if the rules don't speak, then you may not do this. Right? So there's two closure rules. Natural liberty could be a closure rule. The closure rule of natural liberty says whatever is not prohibited is permitted. That's the closure rule of natural liberty. And by prohibited, I also mean something that's required, because if something is required, then its non-performance is prohibited. So for this purpose, whether something is required or prohibited, we can translate one in terms of the other. If I'm required to do X, then I'm prohibited from not doing X. And if I'm prohibited from doing X, then I'm prohibited from doing X. So the closure principle of natural liberty says if the rules don't say anything about it, if it's not prohibited, go ahead and do it. Okay. The residue prohibition principle says if it's not permitted, it's prohibited. How should I close the system? I look for permissions. If I can find a permission, I do it. If I can't find a permission, I can't do it. With the system of natural liberty, I look at the list of rules, and if there's a prohibition, I can't do it, and if I can't find a prohibition, I can do it. So they're closing out in different ways. Right? We need closure rules to have a teachable and decisive morality, and these are two possible closure rules we might use. And we know in sometimes we use various closure rules. For example, in a game of chess, we use the residue prohibition principle. The rules of chess don't tell you all the things you can't do. The rules of chess don't say, for example, what my brother always used to do. When he was losing, he would throw the board in the air at my face. Right? Now, I can't say, look, there's a prohibition in the rule of chess about that. No, rules of chess give permissions. You can move this way. You can move that way. And if there's not a permission, you can't do it. Rules of chess are very complicated, but nevertheless, if there's not a permission in the rule, then it's not permitted, which means that the rules of chess is a residue prohibition principle. Other things that we'll look at are obviously closure principles of natural liberty. For example, consider the child's game, don't let the balloon touch the ground, and don't hold the balloon. Two prohibitions that we'll look more in detail at. That's the child's game. There's a balloon at a party, you can't hold it, and you can't let it touch the ground. Anything else goes in that game. If the child wants to jump on furniture, as far as the game goes, that's perfectly fine. Right? So we know there are some games that are residue natural liberty. We know there's some games that are residue prohibition. What in the experiments we want to talk about, I'll get to in a minute, is how people can learn these rules. What I almost forgot to say is that if you deny natural liberty, then you are stuck with residue prohibition. There's only two things you can say. If the rules don't speak to it, you can do it, or unless the rules speak to it, you can't do it. So when philosophers say there's something suspicious about natural liberty, there shouldn't be natural liberty, there shouldn't be this closure rule of natural liberty that unless it's prohibited, you can do it, then they're committed to saying, well, then morality must be a residue prohibition system. If it's not justified, you can't do it. Because remember, the criticism of natural liberty is it talks about you can do something which isn't justified. If everything has to be justified, then we have a residue prohibition system that unless there's a justification, you can't do it. So those philosophers, those Kantians, those welfarists who reject natural liberty must accept the residue prohibition principle if they believe in teachability and if they believe in decisiveness. Okay. So these are exhaustive and exclusive categories. If you reject one, you've got to accept the other. So now the question is, can people actually learn these two systems of rules, especially for moral rules? And we'll begin to get at that. It's a very difficult question. Are they equally able to be taught? Do people not tend to learn one, they tend to learn the other? Can we, since teachability is one of the desiderata of a social morality, one of the things we have to look at is, are they both teachable? Right? Now that one of the things we want from a morality is that it actually can be taught, first question is, can it be taught? So here's where Sean and I ran some experiments about the sorts of rules people can teach. Now, the assumption behind the experiments is what's sometimes called efficient learning theory. Efficient learning theory is basically this, and it's been shown to have a great deal of predictive power. When a learner is trying to learn something, and the teacher points something out, the learner assumes that that's the really important bit of information the teacher's pointing out. It's not just some information, but the learner says, if the teacher's marking that case, that must be a really important case. Teachers don't waste my time by marking the unimportant stuff. Teachers mark the important stuff. And this is efficient learning theory. If you want to in the discussion, we can talk about efficient learning theory. And there's been some nice tests, nice studies which provide significant support for it. If efficient learning is right, then here's what a learner should think. If the teacher only points out prohibitions to me, it must be because the prohibitions are the thing that's really necessary in this system. What I can't do, what the rules say I can't do, that's the important thing. Well, if that's what the important thing is, what I can't do, then it's a natural liberty system, because the rules point out the things I can't do. The natural inference would be, if I can't do it, I should close with natural liberty. On the other hand, if the teacher points out to me permissions, you have to have a permission to do this, and you have to have a permission to do that, then the efficient assumption is that the teacher's pointing out permissions, because if I don't have a permission, I can't do it. Right? So the assumption behind the studies is efficient learning theory, and that learners are going to take the cue from what they're taught and infer what the closure rule should be. Okay? Because they're going to assume that what they're taught is the most useful information they could be given. Go and go through 4 experiments. These are really very toy experiments to get at a couple interesting dynamics. We'll work up to a little more complicated cases. We're going to start off very, very simple. So here's the first experiment. Before you play game X, the teacher tells you 2 rules. This is in the experiment. The teacher says that while these aren't the only rules, it's enough to get you started. So in this experiment, we're allowing the person to assume it's a more complicated rule system. They don't know all the rules, but they need to get started playing the game. Experiment 1 had 2 conditions, a permission condition and a prohibition condition. In the permission condition, people were told, you are allowed, this is the ball bouncing game to see what's going on, you are allowed to bounce the ball on the ground, and you are allowed to hold on to the ball. That's the permission condition, where we're telling the people what they can do. And the prohibition condition was exactly like that, except we put knots. So you are not allowed to bounce the ball on the ground, and you are not allowed to hold on to the ball. Right? So the only difference between the 2 conditions is that the prohibitions have knots. Okay? Different groups of people. One group of people get the permission condition. The other group of people get the prohibition. Okay? So it's 2 different groups of people being asked these questions. Each group is supposed to put in 1 to 7 scale. In light of the evidence you've seen about the rules, please indicate the extent to which you think game X, you are not allowed to toss the ball in the air. Or you are allowed or are not. So 1 would mean you are not allowed to toss the ball in the air for sure. 7 would mean you are allowed to toss the ball in the air for sure. But it also could be 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 to indicate various degrees of uncertainty about what you may do. Okay, so both groups use the same scale and can put uncertainty. In the first experiment, what we found is that we definitely could get an effect. If you teach people prohibition rules, they definitely lean towards natural liberty. Teaching the prohibition was significantly different than chance and was significantly different than the permission. Permission, however, was not significantly different than chance. That is, the amount which permissions departed from chance was not significant, which meant when we taught prohibitions to people, they started to significantly infer it was a natural liberty system. When we taught permissions, we weren't getting an effect. Permissions weren't doing the same job that prohibitions did in this first original study. Well, one of the worries in this study was that the ball bouncing game looked like maybe it was just a residue prohibition game to begin with, right? Because I gave that as an example of a natural liberty game. So people might have been already acquainted with the game. Some of you might be. So now we put a game that was more of a board game to see if there's a frame towards permission in this game, right? I'm worried that there's a bit of a frame towards natural liberty in the ball game. So now in another experiment to see whether there's a frame towards board games, which are permissive rules, and see whether we get the results reversed or whether there's actually a tendency to infer natural liberty. Same sort of thing. Experiment 2, you are allowed to put the red peg in the black square, or you are not allowed to put you're not allowed to put the green peg on the black square. The prohibition condition, you're not allowed to put the red peg, and you're not allowed to put the green peg. Same thing. Experiment 2 again. Please, in light of the evidence you've seen about the rules, indicate the extent to which you think the game in X, you are or are not allowed to put a blue peg in a black square. Again, they can say 1 to 7. And again, find out that the effect is towards natural liberty, but not towards permission at this point. So it wasn't the case that the original experiment was cueing natural liberty. Board games, if anything, or things about boards, if they cue anything, they should cue permissions. In fact, there's no cueing of permissions going on here. We also have the natural liberty effect is significantly different than chance. The natural liberty effect is significantly different than permissions, but the permission is still not significantly different than chance. Okay, so we're getting effects with natural liberty if we teach prohibition, we're not getting significant effects with permissions. Tried another experiment. There was a couple of reasons for this second setup. First, we're trying to get something a little more normative, a little more like a behavioral rule as opposed to a game rule. Now you might say, well, why don't you just choose the sort of rules we're all familiar with? Why don't you choose a moral dilemma? Remember, we don't want people to come with their answer already in their mind. We want to see whether or not teaching them a rule about something pushes them towards an answer. So what we want to try to do is get rules that they never thought of, therefore can't jump to the conclusion. So if we use real moral cases, we're going to get their pre-existing moral answers. And rather than getting effect between rules and conclusions, we're just going to get something about their moral beliefs. So we have to use stories that they're not familiar with what the answer should be, right? And that's one of the reasons why you go for artificial stories. This story actually was based on, these are tribute to a famous experiment. Denise Cummins in 1996 ran a really famous experiment where she showed that 3- and 4-year-olds can detect cheaters on rules. That was one of the very first experiments to show that cheater detection comes as one of the first human competencies, and she used this mice game to show cheater detection. This is not about cheater detection, but it's a bit of a tribute to Denise. So here's the way this experiment goes. There's a farm with squeaky mice. In the actual experiment, children got to squeak the mice, so squeaky mice doesn't make a lot of sense here. But that's okay, because we don't want it to make too much sense. There's a farm with squeaky mice, and all the mice are supposed to follow the rules of mice written down in a book. The farm has 4 barns, red, blue, yellow, and green. Okay, we can get 4-year-olds can get this, so I hope most of us get this too. Experiment 2, and there's 2 conditions of this experiment. The permission says the rules of mice say that squeaky mice are allowed to be in the red barn, and squeaky mice are allowed to be in the yellow barn. Are the squeaky mice allowed to be in the green barn? Prohibition, again, puts knots in. Are the squeaky mice allowed in the green barn? Again, we used a 1.1 to 7 scale. Now we start to get more effect. Prohibition condition is significantly different than permission training. Response is different from chance in the prohibition training and in the permission training condition. So not only, you can see we're getting a much higher effect on the rules that are invoking a game. Very, very nice effect, significant effect in the prohibition. Very strong effect that if I'm given 2 prohibition rules, just 2, I'm inferring natural liberty. I can do it. If I'm given 2 permission rules, there now is some tendency to close it with residue prohibition, but a much weaker tendency, okay, but still significant. We also ran a mixed version because we're thinking, is it harder to get people to go towards natural liberty? Is it harder to get people to go towards residue prohibition? The first results suggested that, but the way to get at it is to run a mixed version. Give them one rule that says that squeaky mice are not allowed to be in the red barn, and the second rule is a permission rule. Squeaky mice are allowed to be in the yellow barn. So now we're giving the same subjects 2 different rules, and we're asking them, given their 2 different rules, to make a conclusion, and they tend to infer towards natural liberty by some. Okay. That is, when they lean towards natural liberty. 4.33 is on the natural liberty side of the scale. Final set of experiments, and there was 2 things I wanted to get at with this final set of experiments. One, because normative judgments usually force you to act, I wanted to get rid of the exact midpoint sitting on the fence. Because typically in normative life, you've got to do one thing or another. You can't just sort of say, I'm uncertain. We can on questionnaires and we can in empirical questions, but normative questions sort of force us in some sense to make choices. So one thing we did is we made a 6-point scale. So we only took away the middle. They still can have uncertainty, but they generally have to lean one way or another. The other thing we wanted to do is distinguish people explicitly using a closure rule from guessing what the remaining rules might be. Remember, up till now, they could just be guessing, well, given all this, I infer there is a rule about this. So with this one, we say the rule of mice only has 2 rules. There's no more rules. This is it for the rules of mice. Okay? Squeaky mice are allowed to be in the red barn. Squeaky mice are allowed to be in the yellow barn. Are they allowed to be in the green barn? The rules of mice only has 2 rules. Squeaky mice are not allowed to be in the red barn. Squeaky mice are not allowed to be in the yellow barn. Are the squeaky mice allowed to be in the green barn? Here the effects are quite dramatic when we did these 2 things. The effect on natural liberty of giving the 6-point scale and saying only 2 was a strong increase. That is, the people who were told there's only 2 rules on a 6-point scale, which way you're going to go, we can see that the average of the people trained on prohibition was well over 5 out of 6. We got a very strong result again with the permissions. When people had to split in the permission, if you're only given 2 permission rules, you did split towards natural prohibition, to residue prohibition. But quite remarkable is the mixed in this case. That is, the mixed, people were given 2. The order is randomized throughout, so it's not an order effect. If they're only given 2 rules, they say these are the only 2 rules, and they're given mixed, and then they're forced, at least in a 6-point scale, not a 2-point scale, they're forced to decide what to do, they go almost as strongly for natural liberty as do those who are only trained on prohibition, which confirms the suspicion that we had that it's easier to incline people, significantly easier to incline people towards a natural liberty system than towards a system of residue prohibition. So let me just summarize what we think the experiments up the paper up till now. First of all, I think a teachable, decisive system of morality has to employ a closure rule. Right? If it's going to be decisive, there's got to be a rule for everything. You say, okay, what are you going to do? The closure rule is like your all-purpose default. And it's got to be decisive, so there must be something to do. So if the rules don't speak, you either have to do it, either you can do it or you can't, and the closure rule tells you that. Normal learners tend to infer a rule when they learn a rule domain. It's not hard at all. It is not very hard anyway to get normal learners, when you teach them, to infer that there is a closure rule. If you tell them there are more rules, they infer a closure rule. But even if you tell them there are no more rules, there are no more justified rules. If you think of each one of the rules in the system as one of the justified rules, there are no more justified rules. They still infer, if you're taught on prohibition, that you can do it. Either closure rules, though, can be taught. We've seen that. It's not like you can't teach residue prohibition. If prohibition rules are taught, the tendency is to infer natural liberty. And if permission rules are taught, the tendency is to infer residual prohibition. There's some bias, and in the last experiment, a very strong bias towards natural liberty. Subjects will close the system. I said even if they taught there's a fixed number of rules, you give them something which is outside the rules, they tend to be decisive. Although, remember, we made them be a little decisive by making them come down on a 6-point scale in the last experiment. So we know something about morality. We know this. People infer closure rules. We said that social morality needs them. Do people do them? I mean, you might say, look, you said social morality requires closure. No one closes. One way no one closes is that everyone is just 3.5, right in the middle of the scale, saying, hey, there's no rule for this. But they do close. So if social morality requires closure rules, first good piece of evidence is people close. Second piece of evidence is they tend to close a bit stronger towards natural liberty. What does this tell us about systems of rules? Because I think it's not just an empirical study. I think it has some upshots for how we think about systems of rules in certain sorts of societies. And I want to talk about my friend Russell Hardin. He has, in a number of places, discussed what he calls bioethics. Right? Russell doesn't like rules, so you might get the flavor that this is not someone who likes rules a lot. So Russell says, here's a place where rules make sense. Russell's a consequentialist. So he said, but here's a place where rules make sense. Consider a village society of the 11th century France, in which the villager Bodo lived. We have detailed knowledge of that society from the parish records of the Church of Saint-Germain. Today, one would say that the church is in the center of Paris, but in Bodo's time, it was a rural parish, distant enough from Paris that many of its inhabitants may never have seen Paris. Virtually everything Bodo consumed was produced by about 80 people, all of whom he knew well. Indeed, most of what he consumed was most likely produced by his family. What Russell argues is this. Rules make sense in Bodo's world. Why? Because what do rules do? They identify act types. Right? They say, here's an act you can do, here's an act you can't do. Here's an act you can do, here's an act you can't do. So if you live in a society like Bodo, who has a relatively stable number of act types, I mean, most things, we know what the acts are, we know what the possible ways of living together in a marriage are, we know what the possible ways of buying grain is, we know what the possible ways of harvesting is. We can have a rule for that stuff. And Russell says, therefore, if a set of rules requires a set of act types, and rules seem to refer to act types, right? What is a rule? It says this act type can be done, this act type can't be done, this act type may be done. So Hardin says, look, if rules require act types, then societies with stable act types, they make sense. But if rules require stable act types, and act types are always changing, rules don't make any sense. Right? So Hardin wants to argue that rules are for a static, closed society. That's Bodo ethics. But what Bodo ethics really is, it looks like, is an ethics of residual prohibition. As new action types arise, for example, the first time a certain sort of stranger came to Bodo's village, what will be done? It'll be sorted into a prohibition. Right? All the known sort of act types, the ones that are good, we sort into permissions. Things that are necessary, we sort into requirements. The sort of bad things, we sort into prohibitions. Then something new comes along. It's a very stable society, very closed society. What do? We sort it into prohibition. Right? If we haven't already figured it out, don't do it, which is consistent with being a very small, very conservative society. But what we have to realize is that it's not just rules that makes for Bodo ethics. It's not just rules that make an ethics conservative. It's rules plus that closure principle is what makes the ethics conservative. It makes it conservative saying, here are the act types, and if I don't have a rule for that act type, don't do it. However, in an open society, there's act types new types of acts all the time. I mean, all you people know all sorts of act types that I didn't have any clue of when I was your age. Those act types didn't exist. You not only have the act types, but you have lives built on those act types. Surfing the net, iPhones, not paying attention in class because you're on Facebook. We'd not paid attention in a whole different way. So if there's all these new act types, we know things, new open societies are generating all sorts of new information, all sorts of new act types. But residue permission, a system of natural liberty, allows that to happen. Right? System of natural liberty says, until we prohibit an act type, I mean, as new act types develop, we may end up developing a morality that says, this is a really bad act type. People have tried it out, and we can now see it's a really bad thing. So systems of natural liberties can certainly change by developing a new prohibition rule. But if they haven't developed a new prohibition rule, then people are free to go on. Not because we've shown it's good that they go on, not because we showed it's justifiable for them to go on, it's just that there's no prohibition of them going on. And in the system of natural liberty, if there's no prohibition, you can go on. That's what it means. This means that an experimenter who's trying out something different doesn't have to say to herself, is this something that I'm permitted to do? She doesn't have to, as it were, begin a new activity and look at the rule book and say, is there a permission for this? Does this come under being good to my children? Or does this come under scientific progress for humanity? Can I get it under some rule? And if I can't get it under some rule, I can't do it. So we can see how innovation is going to be stifled if the innovator always has to be asking herself, is this going to be one of the things I'm permitted to do? Thus, it looks like, although we can teach a residue prohibition system, it's going to be a very conservative system. There's a sense in which what we first are going to do is prohibit it, and then if you can show it's a good thing, you can lift the prohibition. So in a residue prohibition system, new act comes along, we sort it into prohibition. If I decide, or we all say morally it's a good thing to do, then we can make a permission for the act. But until that permission is made, it can't be done, which makes the society highly conservative. The natural liberty, which, as I said, people seem to infer quicker in our society, and I can talk about some initial results we have for other societies. But in our society, I'll say for now, natural liberty allows the activity to go on until someone might come up with a conclusive case that it's not something we should do. Now, to conclude, here's what an advocate of residue prohibition might say. They might say, okay, you're right. We can't just have a system that says no to everything new. Well, we should have a system that includes this rider. And the rider is, if one is engaging in some new act type for which there's no current permission in the system of moral rules, you can do it if you can justify it. Remember, we come back to the idea that everything needs to be justified. So now we have like a meta rule. And the meta rule says if you can't find a specific permission, you can do it if you can generate a justification that this is something that's good to do. Right? Sort of a vague meta rule, but it allows you to have your residue prohibition system and yet allow innovation if a person can show the innovation should go on. And you should think of the precautionary principle in ideological ethics for those of you who know that. I don't think it really helps the conservatism very much at all. I mean, you might just say conservatism bad, because I'm not saying conservatism is bad. Maybe we should have a very conservative morality. But this principle doesn't help make it non-conservative very much. And the reason why is that innovators often have very little idea what they're doing. You can't justify something if you don't know what you're doing. And my favorite case here, but there's lots of them, is Fleming and the discovery of penicillin. Fleming was working on ways to grow bacteria. One of his petri dishes became contaminated with a mold. If you asked Fleming, could you justify discovering penicillin, he'd say, I never tried to, when I was doing that, to discover penicillin. I was doing something I thought was entirely different. No way before the fact could I have justified that activity, because that activity isn't one that I knew I was engaging in. That's, I said, the Stanley Ben pebble splitter story is sort of cute because it's a weird act, but that's the interesting thing. It's not an act which seems to have social importance. Remember, Betty asked Alan to redescribe it as an activity worth doing. That's what she's saying to him. That looks like a senseless activity. You're under an obligation to redescribe it to me as something worth doing. That's what proceed with justification says. Redescribe it to me as something worth doing. But the problem is the innovator often can't. Maybe it's a hunch. Maybe it's a really vague idea that this could happen. So if there's the proceed with justification, we're still going to have a society which is leaning towards modal ethics. It's leaning towards society which is going to have a relatively fixed number of act types, and it's going to be hostile to innovation. Which leads us to Hayek, and then our final quote. This seems to support Hayek's claim that freedom granted only when it is known beforehand that its effects will be beneficial is not freedom. If we knew how freedom would be used before it, the need for it, I think we want to have, would be largely disappear. Thank you.